We need to be people of hope, right? That's what the world is looking to us in the Catholic Church, to we Catholics, is for hope. And if you think about it, maybe some of you guys are really young, you don't see this as much as some of those of us who are older. The world is really a lot of people are losing hope. And so they really need to look to us for hope. And honestly, when I see you guys, the young church, you guys give me hope. And so you need to just keep doing that and bring that hope to the world. I'm going to start with a scripture passage, and this is from the book of Hebrews, the letter to the Hebrews, I should say, and it's chapter 11. And it starts out like this. It says, "Faith is the realization of what is hoped for and evidence of things not seen. Because of it, the ancients were well attested. By faith, we understand that the universe was ordered by the word of God, so that what is visible came into being through the invisible. But without faith, it is impossible to please him, for anyone who approaches God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him." And that scripture passage really speaks to me about tonight's saint. We're talking about a guy you might not ever have heard of before, because I don't think I heard about him until about 5 years ago. And until the last year or so, I never really kind of knew anything about him other than his name, and it just sounded like such an odd name. He didn't really kind of get on my radar. But we're talking about Blessed Bartolo Longo, and he's in your workbooks. If you have your workbooks, I don't have the workbook handy, but it's near the back. He's probably about the 158 and 159. If you want to see some pictures of him in there, as you can see, some of these are actually photographs. And so he's someone that he lived in the latter half of the 1800s and the first part of the 1900s. And so he was born in 1841, and Bartolo is Italian for Bartholomew. So it may even be a shortened version of Bartholomew, but that's where the name comes from. Okay, and Bartholomew, of course, was one of the apostles as well. And he grew up. He was born, if you can imagine the boot of Italy, there's that heel on the boot, and he was from a town called Brindisi, which was back kind of on the heel of the boot. And he grew up, his family was very Catholic. He was kind of a mischievous kid, but he was also a really smart kid. And, and things went along pretty well for him. And, but when he was about 10 years old, his mom died. And I think that's when I learned that. It kind of spoke to me a little bit, because it made me think that, my kids might relate to him, because their mom died when they were 12 and 9. And so when I started hearing more about his story, it kind of helped explain a few things to me, I think, a little bit more than I might have thought about earlier. But, life just wasn't the same after that, as you can imagine. This occurrence, when he was 10 years old, kind of set him on a path where he started kind of losing his faith in God a bit, losing his hope. And so by the time he went off to college, he went to the University of Naples, which was, it's kind of on the other side of the boot of Italy. And it was a very secular college during this time, kind of around 1860, late 1850s. It's a time of anti-clericalism, so there's a lot of the government is kind of cracking down on religion, kind of trying to make sure people aren't practicing their faith, trying to turn them away from all that silly nonsense, as they would say. And so this is kind of what he goes into. And the university, as most universities are now, was very secular. And so they were actively, trying to persuade students to kind of give up those silly beliefs. And so this kind of appealed to him, because, this is kind of where he was in his faith life. And also when he was in college, he kind of fell into the trap that a lot of college students fall into, kind of the drinking and the drugs and, hookups and all that kind of stuff. And, so, he just kind of strayed and just kind of continued to kind of go down the wrong paths. Well, one of the things that he started getting into was some occult practices. Things like he would go to like seances and he would practice, like astrology and horoscopes and things like that. And he just started going down some really dark paths. And so that kind of, especially seances and that type of occult stuff opens you up to demonic activity. And he definitely did that because within a year or so, he was determined that he wanted to become a satanic priest. He was practicing Satanism, and he wanted to become a satanic priest, which, again, is pretty about as far away from the faith as you can get. And so he becomes ordained as a satanic priest by people in the area. And so this was a pretty, some people will say, well, Satanism is just kind of it's just kind of a movement against God, and there's not really much to it. Well, at his ordination, he gave himself over to a demon, and the demon manifested. And there were such loud shrieks and wails that the walls literally shook. And Bartolo and several other people fainted out of fright, out of what was going on. Okay, so this was very real, what he was getting into. But this didn't stop him. He kind of kept going off on this path. But what he found out is that instead of making him happy because he was doing the things he wanted to do, he actually became more depressed, more hopeless, and just, he just wasn't finding fulfillment in this. And as often happens when you start getting into things like this, you just kind of want more, and you try and keep trying new things in there. And so this again led him to more hopelessness, more despair. And so finally, he went to a friend of his who was one of his professors, who was actually one of the few that was a Christian. He's practicing Catholic, and he said, "What am I going to do?" And the guy said, "Well, if you want to die in an insane asylum and lose your salvation, just keep going on the path you're going on. But if you want to, kind of turn around, you should come back to the church." And Bartolo wasn't kind of at that point yet. So a little while later, he's out walking on campus, and he hears a voice that says, "Come back to the church, come back to the church." He turns around, there's nobody there. Well, it turns out he's attested this later to it being his father, who had since died, who was calling him back to come back to God and to the church. And so this kind of scared him straight a little bit. And so he went back to his friend. He said, "Okay, how do I do this?" And so his friend paired him up with a Dominican friar. And, and the Dominicans were actually some of the people that he was out there bad-mouthing when he was a Satanist, because the Dominicans are great preachers, and so the Satanists knew that the Dominicans were kind of the enemy. They were like one of the strongest enemies they would have. So anyway, he sets him up with this Dominican friar, and eventually, he winds up kind of working himself back to the church. And on the Feast of the Sacred Heart of Jesus that year, he gives his confession, and he kind of renounces all of the things that he had done. But he still was just not finding fulfillment. I mean, I think he kind of felt like, okay, I'll come back to the church and everything will be great. And that wasn't what was happening, because I don't think his heart, from what I could read, his heart wasn't like fully changed yet. And it seemed like in the past, things had to kind of scare him into action, right? And so he was kind of contemplating this one day, and he realized, he said, okay, well, when a Catholic priest gets ordained, he gets ordained to Jesus Christ and to God. And he thought, I've been ordained a satanic priest. I've been ordained to Satan, and I am now tagged for Satan, and there's no way I can be saved. And he started despairing really badly, and so much so that later on he nearly killed himself again. But at that point, he heard another voice, and it was a woman's voice. And the woman's voice said, "If you want to be saved, promulgate the rosary." And he looked around, there was nobody there. And he attributes that to being Mary coming to him and saying, "This is what you need to do." And at that moment, he was filled with a lot of grace. And he realized, okay, we prayed the rosary when I was a kid. All I got to do is get into the rosary and teach others the rosary, and I'll be saved. And this really became his mission. So around this time, he had also graduated from college, and he had become a lawyer. And so he started his law career. His faith was growing. He was starting like rosary groups and that type of thing where he was. Well, when he was about 24 years old, he wound up going to Pompeii on business. And again, Pompeii you might have heard of. It's the place that the volcano blew up, and I think it was in 79 AD, and kind of leveled the place. And so Naples, if you can kind of imagine the boot of Italy coming down, Naples is here, Mount Vesuvius, the volcano is right here, and Pompeii is right here. And so he was working in Naples. He goes over to Pompeii to do some work for this woman. It was Countess Mariana de Fusco was her name. She was rich. She was a widow, and she had several kids. But she had a lot of business that needed taking care of, and so he was taking care of this business for her in Pompeii. And even in the mid 1800s, there still weren't a lot of people living in Pompeii, and there was a few thousand, and the conditions there were just terrible. And this is one thing he noticed. He said conditions are terrible here, and so he said kind of his self-induced penance was to work with the poor people in Pompeii. He said, "This is what I'm going to do." He went into the church, and the priest there said, "Yeah, I don't have many parishioners. Hardly anybody ever comes in here anymore," and so he and this countess, they kind of started pooling their resources, and they were both very much doers, and they got stuff done. They started kind of rehabbing this church. And one of the things that they did is they bought this painting of Mary as Our Lady of the Rosary, and they got the painting fixed up, and they hung it up, and people started coming in, and they would pray at this picture, and miracles started happening by the people praying at this picture. And so word starts getting around like that, and so people started coming back to church a little bit. And so, he starts working with the poor people. He sets up an orphanage because there's a lot of orphans in the area. There's a lot of crime in the area, so a lot of the kids didn't have like a father at home. And so he set up a school for boys specifically whose parents were inmates, who were prisoners. And so he wanted to try and break this cycle. And so, he just started kind of pouring his heart into helping rebuild this. And as people's hopes started kind of coming back, then they started participating, and everything started snowballing to make this a better place. At one point, there were so many people coming back to church, somebody said, you should just build a brand new church. And so they did. They built what later became the cathedral in Pompeii, and it was devoted to Our Lady of the Rosary. And so he was just doing all these great things, but at the same time, he was also writing down lots of things. He was because he was very educated, he would write down, his reflections and all this kind of stuff. And he started amassing quite a large amount of writings. Well, after some time, it must have been at least after 1878, and the reason for that is that either he or the Countess knew Pope Leo XIII. And what had happened is they had been doing so many things together that people started rumors about them and about their relationship, and were just kind of bad-mouthing them. And so they went to see Pope Leo XIII. And like I said, they must have known him because it sounds like they were just kind of talking very cordially. And he says, well, she's a widow and you're not married. Why don't you just get married and shut everybody up? And they're kind of like, okay, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. So they get married. They're both like in their mid to late 40s, and they decide, okay, well, let's just get married. And so they do. But then they just kind of keep doing what they're doing. They just kind of keep pouring their hearts and souls into rebuilding Pompeii. Not like buildings, but rebuilding the people there, and helping with public works and with schools and orphanages and that type of thing. And so, they did this for like the next 40 years. She died in 1924. He died in 1926. And, he just was this great philanthropist, as was she, in the area. And they were responsible for basically rebuilding Pompeii. And, they really had a huge impact just because of their devotion to Mary, right? And she also had this. And so he's actually responsible, and I found this really interesting, that he's responsible for two really important things in our faith, yet nobody's probably ever heard of him before, okay? And because of his devotion to Mary and his time with prayer, he You guys have all heard of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary. You know, it's one of the mysteries of the Rosary. It's been known forever, but it was never a dogma of the faith, meaning that we had to believe it. And he kind of started the ball rolling with that in the late 1800s, and he kind of started saying, this really needs to be part of our faith. This needs to be something that everybody believes. And, you know, since they knew Pope Leo XIII, you know, they were able to get some things going there. But as with everything at the Vatican, it takes time. And it wasn't until 1950 that the dogma of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary was actually promulgated. But he was responsible for really kind of getting this going. The other thing that he's responsible for is that he, like I said, he spent a lot of time meditating on the life of Jesus and, you know, praying to the Blessed Virgin Mary. And at the time, there was only only three sets of mysteries of the Rosary. There was the joyful mysteries and the sorrowful mysteries and the glorious mysteries. So the joyful mysteries ends when Jesus is about 12 years old. And the sorrowful mysteries begin, basically the beginning of his passion, right? And so he's like 33, and Bartolo's like, there's a lot of stuff in between that's worthy of meditating on it. So he had just volumes of writing on this. And people knew this, and these writings became public writings. Well, at some point in time, a Father Karol Wojtyła discovered these writings, and he really got into them and realized that, you know, there was really something to this. And he had a huge devotion to Mary and the Rosary as well. And so when he was elected Pope in 1978 as Pope John Paul II, he, you know, really kind of started getting the ball rolling in terms of, you know, Bartolo's cause for canonization had been started, but John Paul really kind of jump-started it. And so in 1980, Bartolo was beatified. So he was made a blessed at that point in time. And in 2002, John Paul wrote an encyclical called On the Rosary of the Blessed Virgin Mary, or it's Rosarium Virginis Mariae. And in there, and this is in 2002, so like 22 years ago, he basically says, you know, he presents the luminous mysteries, which are the reflections on the life of Jesus. And he says, he doesn't say you have to pray these, but he says, in his wording was like, I suggest that we include this in the Rosary as our meditation. So, and he totally credits Bartolo. He's like, this guy had these writings and they're really good. And so there's Bartolo Longo. He, like I said, two major things in our faith, and yet we've never heard of him. Okay, so he's someone that I would really encourage you to get to know. And when you see the pictures of him, you know, except for the picture when he was young, he kind of looks like he's a satanic priest in one of his early pictures. The rest of his pictures, you know, he just looks like this really nice guy that you just want to get to know. And so I would recommend that you get to know him a little bit. There's a prayer that you can pray on the back of that card, and just, you know, ask him how he can become part of your life. Maybe he'll help you with your devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary. Take a lesson from him that if we start to lose our hope, we need to find a way to get it back. And it might mean talking with somebody that we trust. It might mean, you know, spending some time in front of the Blessed Sacrament and praying about it. But at all costs, we can't lose our hope. Because once we do, we really start heading down some bad paths and we start despairing. And, you know, unfortunately, there's a lot of people, the suicide rates are way up in the last 5 to 10 years. And it's because people are losing their hope. And so we need to be people of hope as Catholics. And so that's something that should be a challenge for all of us to try and maintain that, so that we don't despair and fall into these really grave sins, and maybe, you know, some people can't find a way out. You heard me talk about a little bit in here, in that scripture reading I read was on hope. Okay, it's, you know, faith is based on the hope of the things that we can't see. I better read it because It started off, faith is the realization of what is hoped for and evidence of things not seen. So faith and hope, which are two of the theological virtues, kind of go hand in hand, right? Because remember when he came back to the faith, he had faith, but he still didn't have his hope back. And so he needed both of those to really kind of turn things up a notch. All right? And so what I want to do is I want to read, tonight's reflection is actually a story from the Bible, as long as I can find it. It's in Luke chapter 8. It's Luke chapter 8. Where'd it go? There it is. Verses 40 through 56. And there's two stories of hope in here. And it's a very familiar story. You guys could probably know this by heart, but really listen to the words of this and see where you can pick out hope. And that's what I want you to reflect on, because we need to be people of hope, right? That's what the world is looking to us in the Catholic Church, to we Catholics, is for hope. And if you think about it, maybe some of you guys are really young, you don't see this as much as some of those of us who are older. The world is really a lot of people are losing hope. And so they really need to look to us for hope. And honestly, when I see you guys, the young church, you guys give me hope. And so you need to just keep doing that and bring that hope to the world. All right? And so, if you want to write this down, so today is Wednesday, February 28th. If you just want to call this Stories of Hope, you can do that. And again, if you want to cite the passage in there, it's Luke 8, verses 40 through 56. It says, when Jesus returned, the crowd welcomed him, for they were all waiting for him. And a man named Jairus, an official of the synagogue, came forward. He fell at the feet of Jesus and begged him to come to his house, because he had an only daughter, about 12 years old, and she was dying. As he went, the crowds almost crushed him. And a woman afflicted with hemorrhages for 12 years, who had spent her whole livelihood on doctors and was unable to be cured by anyone, came up behind him and touched the tassel of his cloak. Immediately her bleeding stopped. Jesus then asked, "Who touched me?" While all were denying it, Peter said, "Master, the crowds are pushing and pressing in upon you." But Jesus said, "Someone has touched me, for I know that power has gone out from me." When the woman realized that she had not escaped notice, she came forward trembling. Falling down before him, she explained in the presence of all the people why she had touched him and how she had been healed immediately. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace." While he was still speaking, someone from the synagogue official's house arrived and said, "Your daughter is dead. Do not trouble the teacher any longer." On hearing this, Jesus answered him, "Do not be afraid, just have faith and she will be saved." When he arrived at the house, he allowed no one to enter with him except Peter and John and James, and the child's father and mother. All were weeping and mourning for her when he said, "Do not weep any longer, for she is not dead, but sleeping." And they ridiculed him because they knew that she was dead. But he took her by the hand and called to her, "Child, arise." Her breath returned, and she immediately rose. He then directed that she should be given something to eat. Her parents were astounded, and he instructed them to tell no one what had happened. So think about how those people's hope helped generate their faith, and what was the result.